He set it down, slid the page across the polished table, and rose without a word. Claire leaned back in her chair, unhurried, and let her gaze travel over him one last time. The worn jacket, the tired shoulders, the man she had long since stopped admiring. Her mouth curved into a slow, satisfied smile, the smile of a woman who had counted every card before the game began and knew exactly how it would end. She would keep the house, the accounts, the name everyone admired. Her attorney gathered the papers with the quiet efficiency of a closed case. Joel walked out into the gray afternoon with a single worn duffel over his shoulder and a sleeping 6-year-old against his neck, small fists curled into his collar. Everyone in that room believed they had just watched a man lose everything. The story did not begin in that conference room. It began 2 years earlier in the smallest room of a house on a quiet street in Austin, Texas, where a single lamp burned long after midnight. Joel Carter worked best when the world had gone silent. By day, the house belonged to a 6-year-old to spilled cereal and untied shoelaces, to the relentless, joyful gravity of a boy named Theo, who needed someone, always. Someone. And that someone was almost always his father. Joel packed the lunches. He drove the morning route to the elementary school and the afternoon route home. He knew which songs calmed Theo in the back seat and which stuffed animal could not be forgotten at bedtime under any circumstances. He had built his whole rhythm around the small, unglamorous machinery of keeping a child whole. And then when the house finally exhaled and the lamp came on, he built something else. He was 38, a freelance software engineer who took contracts when they came and turned them down when they interfered with school pickup. To anyone watching from the outside, that made him a man without ambition, a man who had quietly surrendered his career to his wife's. But in that small room between midnight and 3 in the morning, Joel was assembling a data management platform for mid-sized businesses, line by line, week after week, with a patience that looked a great deal like nothing at all. He paid for none of it with shared money. That had been a deliberate choice, made the way Joel made most things without announcement. Years before the marriage, his father had died and left him a modest inheritance, and Joel had never folded it into the household. He kept it in an account under his name alone, and from that account, he bought the servers, the licenses, the second-hand machine that hummed in the corner of the small room. When the platform took its first real shape, he registered the intellectual property in his own name, told himself it was simple bookkeeping, and went back to work. His wife never asked what he did in that room. There was a time early on when she might have, when the two of them had nothing but a cramped apartment and a shared certainty that they would build something together. But that time had thinned and finally vanished somewhere on Claire Whitmore's climb. Claire was 36, and she was very good at being admired. As marketing director for one of the larger technology firms in the city, she moved through glass lobbies and corner offices the way other people moved through their own living rooms. She was sharp, ambitious, and quick to read a room, quick to win it. She had married Joel when they were both young and unremarkable, and somewhere along the way she had begun to experience him as a kind of drag on her velocity. The husband who stayed home, the man who could not be introduced at a company dinner without a small, careful pause before the word freelance. She did not see the lamp, or she saw it and decided it was nothing. The night it ended did not feel to Joel like an ending. It felt like a meeting that had been scheduled without his knowledge. Claire came home a little after 8, set her bag on the counter, and told him she wanted a divorce. Her voice carried no heat in it, no grief, no accusation. It was the even-prepared tone of a woman who had rehearsed the words in the car and found them satisfactory. She had already retained an attorney, she said. There was no use dragging it out. They simply weren't moving in the same direction anymore. Joel stood at the sink with a dish towel in his hands and understood several things at once. He understood first that the decision was old. She was not asking him a question. She was informing him of an outcome. and he understood second what she had not said. For weeks, a name had been surfacing on her phone with a frequency that had nothing to do with marketing campaigns Derek Sloan introduced once in passing as a new business partner. Joel had not gone looking. He simply lived in the same house as a woman who had stopped bothering to hide the screen, and the name was there, again and again, late and early, like a watermark pressed into the paper of their days. He did not say the name. He folded the towel along its seam and set it down. What unsettled him was not the word divorce. He had felt the marriage cooling for a long time, the way you feel a season turn before you can name the day it happened. What unsettled him came 2 days later in the language of the proposal her attorney sent over. Claire wanted primary custody of Theo. She wanted the house. She wanted the shared accounts. And to Joel, she offered weekend visitation a Saturday, a Sunday, a clean and narrow corridor of fatherhood, and nothing else. The reasoning laid out in cool legal sentences was almost elegant in its cruelty. Joel had no stable income. He held no fixed employment contract. There was no significant property in his name, no documented earnings a court could weigh and approve of. A man like that, the argument implied without ever saying it outright, could not provide a child with a stable, independent home. A man like that should be grateful for the weekends. He read it twice at the kitchen table, while Theo built a tower of blocks on the floor beside him, narrating an elaborate story in which the tower was a rocket, and the rocket was going somewhere very important. Joel watched his son's hands, small, certain, completely unaware, and felt something in his chest go quiet and cold and clear. On paper, they were right. That was the worst part. Every line of it was technically true. He was the father who had done the invisible work, and invisible work left no record a judge could read. For a few days he considered the easy road, because the easy road is always there and always reasonable. He could sign. He could absorb the loss, the way he had absorbed so much else, swallow the unfairness, take his 2 days a week, and avoid a legal war he could not obviously afford against a corporation's worth of lawyers. There was a kind of peace in that surrender. It was the peace of a man who has decided that fighting will cost more than losing. The thing that broke the easy road came on a Tuesday night at the edge of sleep. Joel had finished the bedtime route teeth water, the correct stuffed animal located and installed, and he was sitting on the edge of Theo's small bed when his son reached up and looped both arms around his neck. The boy smelled of toothpaste and the faint, warm sweetness of childhood. He held on the way children do, with no awareness of holding on at all. "Dad," Theo said into his shoulder, "are you still gonna be here when I'm big?" It was not a dramatic question. Theo asked it the way he asked about dinosaurs and whether the moon followed the car. But it landed somewhere beneath Joel's ribs and stayed there. "Yeah, buddy," Joel said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "I'm gonna be here. Promise. I promise." He sat there long after the boy's breathing had slowed and gone deep, the small fists relaxing one finger at a time against his collar. Somewhere out in the dark of the house, a divorce was being assembled by people in suits who had never met his son. They had drawn a corridor 2 days wide and called it fatherhood. And Joel realized, sitting on the edge of that bed, that he could survive almost anything they took from him: the house, the savings, the careful life she had built, except the one thing he had just promised not to lose. He would not sign a single unjust line of it. The decision did not arrive as anger. Anger would have been easier and louder and gone by morning. What arrived instead was the same patience that had carried him through 2 years of midnights, slow, deliberate, immovable. If they wanted to argue that a man without a paper trail could not raise his own child, then Joel would simply have to become a man they could not argue with. The next morning after the school drop-off, he sat in the parked car in the empty lot for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. Then he took out his phone and made a call he had been circling for 2 days. He had asked around carefully the way he did everything, and one name had come back from 3 different directions. A family attorney with a reputation that made other attorneys lower their voices. People described her in the same 2 words over and over, as though they were her full legal title, cold and very good. The line connected on the second ring. Oaks, a woman's voice said. Clipped, unhurried. The voice of someone who had already decided how much of her day you were worth and was waiting to be proven right. My name is Joel Carter, he said. I think my wife is about to take my son, and I think she's counting on me being too tired to stop her. There was a brief evaluating silence on the other end, not hesitation, but assessment, the sound of a sharp mind, turning a problem over to find its edges. That's a very specific way to put it. Mr. Carter, Sandra Oaks said at last, most people lead with the house. The house isn't the part that matters. No, she agreed, and something in her tone shifted by a single degree, the way a door opens an inch. It usually isn't. Come to my office tomorrow at 9. Bring everything, bank records, the proposal, anything she sent you in writing. And Mr. Carter. The quiet on the line was hers, not his. Don't sign anything before we talk. Not a Christmas card. He almost smiled. I wasn't planning to. That evening, Joel cooked dinner, the way he always had pasta, because it was Theo's favorite, and because routine was its own small act of defiance. And he listened to a 6-year-old explain the rules of a game that appeared to have no rules at all. He did the dishes. He read 2 chapters of a book about a dog who solved mysteries. He tucked his son in and checked twice that the right stuffed animal was in the right place. And only then, when the house had gone silent and exhaled, did he walk down the hall to the smallest room and turn on the lamp. The machine in the corner woke with its familiar low hum. On the screen, the platform waited where he had left it, 2 years of midnights patient, and unannounced the work no one had thought to ask about. Joel sat down in front of it the way he had 1,000 times before, but that night, he wasn't building. That night, he was beginning to understand slowly, and with a strange calm, that the thing he had made in this room might be the only weapon he had. He just didn't yet know how large the weapon was. He didn't know that in an office across town, a quiet conversation had already been had about a project exactly like his, or that the woman sleeping in the house he was about to lose knew far more about the lamp in this room than she had ever let on. He only knew that Tuesday night that he had made a promise to a sleeping boy, and that he was a man who kept his promises. The lamp burned past midnight the way it always had. Outside, the street was dark and still, and Austin slept, and no one watching that ordinary house would have guessed that the man inside it had just stopped losing and started to play. Sandra Oaks's office occupied a corner of the 11th floor, and the morning light came through the glass in a way that left nowhere to hide. She read the proposal once all the way through without expression. Then she set it down on the desk, between them, squared its edges with 2 fingers, and looked at Joel the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. On paper, she said, you look very weak. Joel had expected something gentler, and was relieved not to get it. No property in your name, no employment contract, no income a court can put a number on. She tapped the page once. Her attorneys aren't going to call you a bad father. That's amateur work, and they're not amateurs. They're going to call you a dependent father. A man who has lived on his wife's salary and contributed in ways that are very sweet and impossible to weigh in a custody hearing. They'll be warm about it. That's what makes it dangerous. And the work I've been doing, Joel asked. The software. She let the words sit. Tell me about it. Not the technical part. The part a judge would care about when, how, and with whose money. So he told her. The inheritance from his father kept separate from the first. The account that bore only his name. The servers and the licenses bought from that account, and nothing else. The intellectual property registered to him alone. The 2 years of midnights after the house had gone quiet, the work done in the hours that belonged to no one but him. Sandra listened without writing anything down, which Joel would later understand was her way of paying complete attention. When he finished, she leaned back. "That's better than you know," she said. "But understand the ground we're standing on. This is Texas. The law here assumes that anything created during a marriage belongs to both of you community property, no matter whose hands did the building. The default is against you. What you've just described isn't a defense yet. It's the raw material for one. Separate funds, separate accounts, separate registration work, done outside the marital hours. Every piece of that is a brick. My job is to build a wall out of bricks before her people can knock them over." She fixed him with a flat, level stare. "Which means I need every record, every receipt, every timestamp. We are going to prove the unprovable, Mr. Carter, and we are going to do it with paper, because feelings don't survive a courtroom." Before he left, she gave him one instruction that surprised him. "Agree to the divorce," she said. "Sign that and only that. Don't fight the dissolution, you don't want it either. And a man who fights to stay married to a woman who's leaving looks bitter in front of a judge. But the house, the accounts, the boy, you concede nothing. You sign one page, you walk out, and you let them think whatever they want to think. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do in a room is let people underestimate you." 2 weeks later, in the glass conference room of Claire's attorney downtown, that was exactly what Joel did. They slid the consent across a polished table, his agreement to end the marriage, nothing more, and he signed his name to it without argument or tears, with Theo asleep against his neck after a long afternoon of waiting. Claire watched him with the easy smile of a woman certain the rest would follow. Her attorney gathered the papers like a closed case. Joel shouldered his bag and carried his son out into the gray afternoon, and let every person in that room believe they had just watched him lose everything. He had signed away nothing that mattered. The weeks that followed taught Joel what a war of attrition felt like when it was waged politely. Claire's team, funded, he came to understand, by the deep institutional pockets of the firm that employed her, never raised its voice. It simply applied pressure in 100 small places at once. They requested a psychological evaluation of Joel, framing it as a routine matter, a box to be checked, while the implication hung in the air like a smell. Is he stable? Is he well? Can a man who has organized his whole life around a child be trusted with that child alone? The suggestion was poison precisely because it could not be answered. To object too strongly was to seem unstable. To comply without complaint was to admit there was a question worth asking. And then there was Theo. The visitation schedule, never generous to begin with, began to fray. A Saturday pickup was moved to Sunday because of a scheduling conflict that was never explained. A weekend was canceled entirely. Theo had a cold, Claire said, though. When Joel called, the boy sounded bright and restless and asked 3 times when he could see his dad. The pattern was small enough that any single instance seemed reasonable. Together, they were a slow erosion, a steady hand pressing down on Joel exactly where it hurt most. He understood what she was doing. She was teaching him one canceled weekend at a time how much it would cost to keep fighting. She was betting he would tire. He did not tire. But he did not sleep much either. The thing that changed the shape of the war arrived on an ordinary Thursday in Sandra's office in the form of a single sentence she delivered while reading something on her screen. "Mr. Carter," she said slowly, "did you know that someone has offered to buy your platform?" Joel went still. "No, someone has." She turned the monitor toward him. "A technology investment fund. The offer is preliminary. Nothing signed, nothing public. But the valuation they've floated is in 8 figures. She let that land. "Did you solicit this?" "I never pitched it to anyone." His voice came out quiet. "I put the core engine up as an open repository under my own name, just to test it to see whether it held up in the open. I never sent it to a fund. I never told a soul it was for sale. I was going to finish it before I—" He stopped. He had been going to say before I told Claire, and the irony of that arrived a half-second too late to swallow. Sandra was watching his face with an attention that had gone very sharp. "Here is what I want you to sit with," she said. "Because I've been doing this for 22 years, and I have learned to distrust convenient timing." She turned back to her records, pulling up a second document, a third. "Your wife filed for divorce on a particular date. I have the timestamps on the proposal on the early correspondence between her attorney and her firm's legal department. And I have something else now. There is a thread of contact through her new business associate, a Mr. Derek Sloan, that brushes up against the same investment circles that produced this offer. You're saying she knew. I'm saying the timing isn't an accident." Sandra's voice did not rise. It sharpened, which was worse. "She didn't move slowly and then get surprised by your good fortune. She moved fast. Faster than the dissolution of a quiet marriage requires. She pushed to finalize before this offer could surface, because the moment it becomes public, it becomes an asset on the table. An asset she would have to fight you for in the open with a judge watching. Far cleaner to take the house and the accounts from a man everyone agrees has nothing, and be gone before anyone learns what he was actually holding." Joel sat with it and felt the floor of the entire story tilt and reset beneath him. For weeks he had carried himself like a man, losing gracefully a father who had done the invisible work and could prove none of it, absorbing the unfairness, because that was what decent men did. He had pitied himself a little in the privacy of those midnights and been ashamed of the pity. But that was not the story. That had never been the story. Claire had not left him because he was a man going nowhere. She had left him because she had glimpsed somehow that he was a man about to arrive, and she wanted to be certain she was holding the deed when he did. He was not a husband being discarded. He was an asset being quietly harvested by someone who knew exactly what he was worth and was betting he never would. The pity went out of him like air from a room, and something colder and clearer took its place. "Okay," he said. "Okay." Sandra agreed, and for the first time since he had met her, the corner of her mouth moved. Claire escalated when she realized he would not fold. It came at him from a direction he had not fully anticipated. Through Derek Sloan and the easy social gravity of people who knew people, word began to move through the investment circles around the buyout. Nothing actionable, nothing he could point to. Just a fog of doubt seeded carefully into the right conversations. Was the ownership clean? Was the founder in the middle of a custody dispute? Were there complications? A fund would be wise to wait out. It was the corporate equivalent of the psychological evaluation, an unanswerable question planted to grow. And then on a Wednesday night, Claire came to him in person. Joel had taken a small furnished place across town for the duration. 2 rooms, a kitchenette, a window that looked out on a parking lot, and he was at the table going over records for Sandra when the knock came. Theo was already asleep in the other room. Claire stood in the doorway in a coat that cost more than the month's rent, and Joel knew at once that she had not come to reconcile. She had come to close. "Can I come in?" she asked. He stepped back to let her, because Theo was sleeping, and he would not have this on the doorstep. She did not sit. She looked around the small room with an expression that was not quite contempt, something gentler and more wounding, a kind of pity. Then she made her offer, and she made it well, because making offers was what she was good at. He would sign a settlement and a confidentiality agreement. He would take a modest cash sum and walk away from the custody fight. In exchange, she would lift her quiet pressure on the buyout. The deal would proceed. Everyone would get something. No one would have to bleed. "You're a better father than you'll ever be a businessman." "Joel," she said, and her voice was almost kind. "That's not an insult. It's just true. Don't walk into a room you were never built to stand in." Joel looked at her for a long moment, at the woman he had married, when they had nothing, who had counted every card before the game began. "Go home, Claire," he said quietly, and opened the door. She studied him, recalculating, and then she went her heels precise on the concrete walkway, and the door clicked shut behind her. But that night, after the parking lot light had stopped throwing her shadow across his window, Joel sat alone at the table and felt for the first time the full weight of what he had set in motion. It was one thing to refuse to lose. It was another to drag a 6-year-old through the slow machinery of a fight this size. The lawyers, the evaluations, the canceled weekends, the long uncertainty of it. In the other room, Theo slept with one arm thrown over the edge of the bed. Joel sat very still and let the doubt arrive because he had learned not to lie to himself in the dark. He wondered whether a child would rather have a father who won or a father who was simply reliably there, and whether he had the right to gamble the second in pursuit of the first. He did not have an answer by morning. He only had the work and the promise, and so he kept going. The bottom fell out a week before the hearing. It surfaced first as a short item on a technology news site, the kind of post that gets shared before anyone checks it. The story described the buyout of Joel's platform, inaccurately and damagingly characterizing the project as carrying unresolved intellectual property complications tied to an ongoing divorce. It was phrased to sound like sober reporting and engineered to sound like risk. Within hours, the fund's representatives had requested a pause in negotiations, pending legal due diligence. A preliminary offer in 8 figures does not vanish in a day, but it can go cold, and Joel felt it cooling in real time. The same morning, the court received a supplemental filing from Claire's side, a petition to freeze all assets connected to the software project for the duration of the proceedings. If granted, it would lock the one thing that might have proven Joel's strength inside a legal vault until long after the custody question had been decided. Sandra called him at noon. He could tell from the first word that she was not calling with comfort. If the court grants the freeze, she said, the deal stalls indefinitely, and you lose your only real leverage. We'd be back to where they wanted you, all along, a man with no provable assets, fighting for his son on their terms. She did not soften it, and he was grateful again that she never did. I won't tell you it's over, but I'll tell you it's bad. He stood at the window of the small apartment phone to his ear and looked out at the parking lot where Claire's shadow had stretched a week before. The asset was frozen in all but name. The deal was slipping. The custody of his son was no surer than it had been the day she set her bag on the counter and informed him of the outcome. And he was, when it came down to it, exactly what that first proposal had said. He was a man with a duffel bag and a sleeping child, and very little a court could weigh. But Sandra had not finished. "There's one more thing," she said, and her tone changed by that same single degree he had learned to listen for. "I've been tracing the leak. That news item didn't come from a journalist digging. The specific details in it, the framing about the divorce, the IP language, that information existed in exactly 2 places. It was known to your wife, and it was known to Derek Sloan." A beat of pure cold satisfaction came down the line. "Someone handed that story to a reporter, Mr. Carter, and there are only so many hands it could have come from." Joel watched the empty parking lot a moment longer. "Then we find the hand," he said. "We find the hand," Sandra agreed. Outside, the afternoon light flattened toward evening, and somewhere across the city a hearing was 8 days away, and Joel Carter, who everyone agreed, had nothing, hung up the phone, and went to wake his son for dinner. The morning of the hearing arrived clear and bright, the kind of Texas sky that has no opinion about what happens beneath it. Joel was awake long before it. He had laid out his clothes the night before, the one good jacket pressed, and made Theo's breakfast, and walked the boy to the neighbor, who would mind him for the day, crouching to fix a crooked collar, and promise he would be back by dinner. Then he had stood at the curb of the small apartment with the parking lot at his back, and waited because Sandra had told him only that a car would come and that he should let it. The car that came was a black Lamborghini, low and impossibly clean, and the man driving it was Grant Heller. Joel knew the name without ever having met the face. Heller was the principal investor behind the fund that had floated the 8-figure offer, the quiet money at the center of the whole storm. And Joel had assumed, in the way you assume things about people who move that kind of capital, that they did not appear in person for matters as small as one man's divorce. But here he was in a parking lot on the wrong side of town, leaning across to push the passenger door open. "Get in," Heller said. "You're going to be early, and early is good. Let's them watch you walk in." Joel got in. The interior smelled of leather and money and something faintly electric. Heller pulled out into the morning traffic without explaining himself, and for several blocks he said nothing at all, letting the city slide by the glass. "One of my engineers kept hitting the same repository," he said finally. "Yours. Told me the architecture was the cleanest thing he'd seen in a year, and that it was sitting out in the open under a real name with nobody attached to it, trying to sell anything. Nobody sends me code. They send me decks. You didn't send me anything, which is the only reason I went looking." He glanced over. "You built something clean and quiet for 2 years and told no one. I wanted to know what kind of man does that." A few blocks from the courthouse, Heller pulled to the curb and put the car in park, and then he did something Joel did not expect. He got out, walked around, and held the driver's door open. "You take it the rest of the way," Heller said. "I'll ride in. A man should arrive at his own war under his own hands." Something like amusement moved behind his eyes. "And it won't hurt for certain people to see who dropped you off." Joel looked at him, understanding the shape of the gift and the cold strategy folded inside the kindness. Then he slid behind the wheel. The courthouse steps were busy when the Lamborghini turned the corner and rolled to a stop in front of them. Local reporters had gathered, the technology buyout had slipped into the press, and a multi-million-dollar deal tangled in a custody fight was a story that wrote itself. Claire's lead attorney was climbing the steps with a thick accordion of files under one arm. Derek Sloan stood near the doors, hands in his pockets, the picture of a man who had come to watch a thing go the way it had been arranged. The car door opened, and Joel Carter stepped out. For one long moment, the whole arrangement on those steps simply stopped. The man everyone in that first conference room had watched lose everything. The husband with the duffel bag, the dependent father, the freelancer who could not be weighed, unfolded himself from $250,000 of machine into the morning light alone, unhurried. Grant Heller emerged from the passenger side a beat later and buttoned his jacket without a word, and that was the detail that landed hardest, because the reporters who knew the name began to murmur it, and the murmur traveled up the steps like a current. Claire was already inside, but Derek was not, and Joel watched the calculation move across the man's face, the sudden queasy arithmetic of someone realizing the board he thought he understood had more pieces on it than he had been told. Joel did not look at him for long. He walked up the steps and through the doors and somewhere up ahead, in a room that had no idea what was coming. The case everyone had decided was already over was about to begin. Inside, Claire's confidence held for exactly as long as it took Sandra Oaks to open her file. The room was formal and unhurried. The judge, an older man with the patient, unimpressed face of someone who had watched thousands of people perform certainty and be wrong. Claire's team led with the script Sandra had predicted weeks earlier: warm, regretful, devastating. A devoted but unstable home life. A father with no provable means. A mother prepared to offer the child stability structure, a name that opened doors. They were good. They had clearly done this before. Then it was Sandra's turn, and she did not raise her voice once. She began with timestamps. She laid out document by document the precise sequence of the dissolution, the date Claire had filed, the dates of the earliest correspondence between Claire's attorney and her firm's legal department, and against them, the date the investment fund's interest in Joel's platform had first stirred. The two timelines lay side by side on the record, like a confession. Claire had not been surprised by Joel's good fortune, and then reacted. She had moved ahead of it, deliberately racing to finalize a clean and quiet divorce before the asset could surface and demand to be divided in the open. The petitioner did not discover this project late, Sandra told the court in the even tone of someone reading a grocery list. She discovered it early, and she structured the timing of this entire proceeding around getting out before it became visible. Claire's attorney objected to the characterization. The judge allowed Sandra to continue. Then came the leak. Sandra produced the trail her people had spent a week reconstructing the path of the damaging news item, the specific phrasing about unresolved intellectual property complications tied to an ongoing divorce language that mirrored details existing in only two informed minds. She traced it step by careful step to its source, not a reporter's investigation, but information passed from Derek Sloan to a contact who had placed the story precisely when it would do the most damage to the deal, and by extension to Joel's only leverage. The disruption of these negotiations, Sandra said, was not market caution. It was manufactured. And it was manufactured by a party acting in coordination with the petitioner. A change moved through the room, then slow and unmistakable. Claire's attorneys began quietly to disagree with one another, the small, sharp whispers of a team discovering that part of its own foundation had been built on something it had not vetted. And out in the hallway, through the narrow window in the courtroom door, Joel caught a single glimpse of Derek Sloan, turning and walking without hurry, and without looking back toward the exit. He did not come in. He was not seen again that day. Sandra closed the asset question with the bricks Joel had handed her in their first meeting, and she laid them down one at a time until they were a wall. The inheritance from Joel's late father, received before the marriage and never commingled. The separate account that had borne only his name. The servers and licenses purchased from that account and no other. The intellectual property registered to him alone. The work performed in the hours after a household had gone to sleep outside the marriage's shared life, funded by separate money built by one set of hands, in a state that began from the assumption that everything made within a marriage belonged to both. Sandra acknowledged the default plainly, and then dismantled it, piece by documented piece, until the presumption simply could not stand against the record. This was not built with marital resources, she finished. It was not built during marital time. It was not built with marital knowledge. It is, by every standard this court applies, separate property, and the petitioner's attempt to freeze it is an attempt to capture something that was never hers to divide. When she sat, the room was very quiet. The judge turned at last to Joel. He set aside the filings and looked at the man directly the way judges do when they have heard all the law they need and want to hear the human being underneath it. "Mr. Carter," he said, "setting the money aside, and we will set it aside for a moment. Tell me why you want primary custody of your son. Not what your attorney would say. What you would say." Joel stood. He did not reach for the platform or the timeline or the fortune that had just been ruled his. None of it had ever been the point. And standing there in the quiet of that room, he found he had only one true thing to offer. "A few weeks ago," he said, "I was putting my son to bed the way I do every night, and he put his arms around my neck and asked me if I was still going to be here when he's big." His voice held steady, low, and plain. He wasn't being dramatic. "He's 6. He asks me where the moon goes. But I've thought about that question every single day since. Everything I've done since then I've done, because I made him a promise that I would be here. I don't want primary custody because of what I built, Your Honor. I want it because I'm the one who's been there. And I don't ever want to be the reason the answer to that question is no." No one in the room said anything. The judge looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded once, and made a note. And the silence held until he spoke again. The rulings came in order, and they came clean. The petition to freeze the assets was denied. The buyout the court found no cause to obstruct would proceed. On custody, primary custody was awarded to Joel with a regular and defined visitation schedule for Claire. And on the question that had set the whole machine in motion, the court held what Sandra had argued the value created by the software project was Joel's separate property, developed independently, with separate funds, outside the shared hours of the marriage. Claire received her standard share of the genuine marital estate, not a dollar more. Joel watched his ex-wife receive the news without expression. She had counted every card before the game began, and she had counted them wrong, and the only sign of it was a stillness in her face that had not been there in the conference room 90 days earlier. Outside on the courthouse steps in the same hard noon light, Grant Heller was waiting with his hands in his pockets. He offered his hand, and Joel took it. "You want to know why I drove across town this morning?" Heller said. "It wasn't the code. I'd already decided on the code." He held the handshake a beat longer than necessary. "I came to see how you'd carry the weight. People show you everything under pressure. You held it." He let go. "We'll finish the paperwork this week. Welcome to the deal, Mr. Carter." The deal closed 10 days later. Joel did not celebrate it. He did not post it anywhere or call anyone to say what the platform had finally become. What he did with the first real money of his life was buy a small house on the outskirts of Austin. Not grand, not impressive, a one-story place, with a porch and a yard that needed work. It was his, and it was Theo's. And that was the entire measure of what it needed to be. That first night in the new house, he did what he had always done. He made dinner because routine had carried him through everything, and he saw no reason to abandon it now. He helped Theo with a worksheet of addition problems at the kitchen table. He found the right stuffed animal and put it in the right place. And when the boy was asleep and the house had gone quiet and exhaled the way the old one used to, Joel carried a cup of coffee out to the porch and sat alone in the dark and let himself feel for a little while the simple weight of having kept his word. He saw Claire one more time about 2 months after the house. It was at a school event for Theo, a low gymnasium, folding chairs, the particular cheerful chaos of children performing for their parents. She was as composed as ever, still able to fill a room, though there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, a tiredness that no amount of polish covered. Joel had heard in the quiet way these things travel that whatever had existed between her and Derek Sloan had not survived the exposure of what they had done. He did not take any pleasure in it, which surprised him a little. They stood near the back wall and traded a few civil sentences about Theo's schedule, about a permission slip, about a field trip the following month. There was no heat in it on either side. Just two people who shared a child and very little else. When the program ended and the parents began collecting their children, Claire turned to go and then stopped and looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "I didn't know you were building that," she said, quietly, almost to herself. Joel looked at her for a moment. There were a dozen things he could have said, and 90 days earlier he might have wanted to say some of them. "I know," he said. That was all. He turned and crossed the gymnasium to where Theo was waiting for him, holding a paper crown that had come loose at one side, and he crouched down and fixed it and took his son's hand and walked out into the evening. There was no triumph in it, and no revenge. There was only a man who had chosen silence at the right moment and patience at the right place, who had refused to lose the one thing that could not be replaced, and who had in the end kept it, his son and himself, walking out the door into the ordinary dark, hand in hand, with everything that actually mattered.